All right, hello everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a quick talk about how we can support our child's gut health and, more importantly, how we can support kids' immune health via their gut. So, in terms of what we'll be covering today, we'll be looking at why gut health matters in children, how to spot the early signs of gut dysfunction, how exactly your gut and particularly your microbiome impacts immune resilience in children and adults. What can we do to help? We'll have a little bit of a chat about the Balanced Beings Kids range and then some top tips to kind of take home and put into practice. So, to get us started, why gut health matters. Your gut health is considered your second brain. So, there's a lot of neuronal connections in this area. 70 to 80% of the immune system is actually located in the gut, and that is things like gut associated lymphatic tissue. Children are particularly vulnerable to immune dysregulation because of their gut health, and that's because their microbiome is still developing, particularly in young infants. And gut health is shifting in kids. So, being in clinical practice and looking at microbiome tests consistently, I have seen a change over the years in terms of poorer outcomes with children and their gut health. And the reasons for that comes down to a few different things. So first and foremost, cesarean sections are on the rise. And in early life, gut health is being impacted by things like medications, processed diet, a lower time frame of breastfeeding, and environmental factors like not spending enough time outside or in the dirt like we used to do sort of 30-40 years ago. So, things to look out for in terms of a dysregulated gut. There are some signs and symptoms. Bloating is one of them. Now, if your child is unable to communicate that they're bloating, you can definitely have a look at their tummy, see if it's distended. Have a little bit of a gentle poke, and if it feels quite firm, potentially there's some trapped gas. Gas is another really good telltale sign. Are they burping a lot more than you would expect? Are they giving out flatulence more than you would expect? The other thing is reflux. So that's particularly apparent in the younger population. You will notice your child potentially in that first year of life, screaming, particularly when you lay them down or after meals. You might notice spitting up. These are some of those signs of potential reflux. And back to the medication, which we were talking about on that first page in terms of how we are altering the microbiome in young children. A lot of kids are put very easily on things like proton pump inhibitors these days. And that can have a pretty profound impact on their digestion and their microbial health because of that. Bowel movements, there's something called the Bristol stool chart, as you can see in this image on the screen. This is a really good sort of chart to print out and put in the toilet, so your kids can have a little look at what their stools might look like. They might not be very good at describing it, but if they have images to attach it to, then it can be a lot easier to get more information from them. But if your child is at an age where they can communicate, some of the questions that I ask in clinic that you could follow up and ask them is, are your stools looking like a snake, or are they a little bit broken up? Can you notice any foods in there? When you're wiping your bum, is it slippery? Trying to figure out if there's mucus in the stool. Also trying to identify if there's any undigested foods. Some things that change your gut health and that dysregulation, definitely looking at microbial imbalances. So, more of those pathogenic bacteria, less of those beneficial bacteria can have a really big impact on gut health long term. Food allergies and intolerances, they're definitely on the rise and something to be aware of. Dairy, gluten are probably two of the biggest ones, but also, eggs, soy, fish, and different food groups like histamines, salicylates, oxalates. There's a whole host of things that children can react to these days. And in terms of the difference between the allergies and the intolerances, allergies are definitely something that elicits an immediate response, whereas intolerances are more delayed. And I would say with food intolerances, it's usually the product of gut dysregulation and not the fact that the child is actually intolerant to the food. So I find that when we correct the imbalances in the gut, they will not respond so badly to those foods that they were originally intolerant to. Recurrent infections, whether that be gut infections or, chronic ear infections, for example, which require multiple rounds of antibiotics, infections that are ongoing can really have an impact on their gut health overall. The other thing to consider is heavy metals. Heavy metal exposure is something we need to consider in this day and age. Even in infants, they can have exposure in utero. So if the mother has been exposed to heavy metals, that is something that can impact them from the get-go. Other early signs of gut dysfunction that aren't so specific to the gut but may indicate that there is something happening in the gut are things like behavioural and developmental signs. So if your child is very irritable, if they have sort of these explosive outbursts of anger going from 0 to 100, in situations where it wouldn't really elicit that kind of response. If your kid's at schooling age, you might notice that they're kind of falling up behind a little bit, finding it difficult to concentrate, and having some difficulties with learning. If they're presenting with low moods, anxiety, withdrawal, these are some other signs that there could be something happening in their gut. The other things to think about, fussy eating, obviously picky eating is quite normal as they age from that 2 to 3 to 4 age, but something that seems unwarranted is definitely worth sort of investigating a little bit further. And low appetite is another thing. If they used to have a really good appetite but you've noticed that that's changed, that could also be a sign of a dysregulated gut. Atopic conditions, asthma, eczema, dermatitis, all of these conditions have really well-researched connections to gut dysfunction, and so that's another sign that there might be something happening. So, how does your gut health impact immune resilience? In terms of talking about the microbiome, we've got 2 slides. So this one's talking about how your beneficial bacteria impact your immunity, and then the following slide will be talking about how pathogenic bacteria can also affect your immunity. Now, there's a lot of words on here that might be a little bit complicated, so I'll try my best to make it easy to understand. The first thing that our beneficial microbes do for us is that they train our immune system. So our immune system has a whole host of cells that can help us. One of them is called T cells. We've also got natural killer cells, and our bacteria directly influence these immune cells. They also help train them. And so in a child that has a dysregulated immune system, the immune system can become a little bit confused. So important to have good levels of beneficial bacteria so that we train this immune system appropriately and it's not overstimulated. Maintaining a gut barrier integrity. I'll talk a little bit about a leaky gut on the next slide. But essentially, we have a gut that is very closely, all of the cells are very closely attached together. And so nothing is supposed to slip through those cracks to the bloodstream down below. That gut barrier integrity is crucial, and our beneficial bacteria are really important in maintaining that. Not only the bacteria, but also nutrition. So making sure that we're getting enough of the substrates that your body needs to maintain that barrier. Secretory IgA is an immunoglobulin that lives in the mucus layer of our gut. So we've got a beautiful mucus layer, and then we've got the underlying cells that are nicely packed together. And secretory IgA is something that is sort of the first line of defense. It identifies pathogens or toxins and sort of gobbles them up so that it doesn't create a further response in the body. Now, not only does it sort of defend against pathogenic bacteria or yeasts or viruses, but it also tags foods as acceptable or non-acceptable. So people or children who have a lower level of secretory IgA, I notice that they do respond negatively to certain groups of foods more than your average individual with healthy levels of secretory IgA. So for example, I have a child who has low levels. They might normally be able to eat dairy, but all of a sudden they've started responding negatively to dairy when they eat it. And so that could just be something as simple as that immune system being confused by those milk proteins or the lactose. Beneficial bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are these lovely little compounds that are produced when the bacteria eat the fiber in our diet. And so they have a couple of different functions. They reduce inflammation. They provide energy to the colon cells, particularly a short-chain fatty acid called butyrate. And, having colon cells that can function appropriately is also very important. They maintain that gut barrier integrity. So really important that we have enough bacteria to produce these compounds because they do a lot. Regulating inflammation. Bacteria definitely have a role in regulating inflammation. They reduce inflammation. They produce these anti-inflammatory compounds. They might also regulate pro-inflammatory cytokines. So really working to reduce that inflammation. They compete with pathogens. I really like using the analogy of a car park. Let's say we had a car park with 100 spaces and maybe 60 of them with good gut bacteria, 30 of them were with more of those pathogenic bacteria, and then we have 10 spaces left. We need to make sure that those 10 spaces are being taken up by the good gut bacteria. So we want to feed those good gut bacteria so that they can compete for the space with those pathogenic bacteria. The other thing they do is they influence other areas of the body. So we've got a gut-brain axis, we've got a gut-lung axis, and they talk. They definitely secrete these compounds that talk to the rest of the body. So it's really important that we maintain those healthy bacteria so that we can influence other areas of the body in a positive way. The other thing that they do is help with vitamin and mineral absorption or producing actual vitamins themselves. Vitamin K2 is one, B12. All of these are really important for immune signaling and for energy for the immune cells. The other thing is coming back to inflammation. When we have an inflamed gut, we cannot absorb nutrition effectively. So iron is a really big one. I notice that kids can't absorb iron if they have a really inflamed gut. Might be because A, they can't absorb it, or B, other pathogenic bacteria are utilizing this iron. So yeah, again, making sure we've got enough of the good stuff, low levels of inflammation, and competing with those pathogens. How does it impact immune resilience from a pathogenic lens? So, when we've got an overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria, it definitely drives chronic inflammation, and it might be low grade inflammation, but that low grade chronic inflammation has a big connection to a lot of different diseases, and it does definitely impact your immune system. There are certain kinds of bacteria that can trigger autoimmune conditions, and this comes down to that hyperstimulation of the immune system and confusion of the immune system, as well as something called molecular mimicry. As we're looking at this image of a leaky gut on the screen, you can see what I was talking about. We've got a beautiful mucus layer and we've got those underlying cells. And those cells are really closely packed together with the blood underneath. And then on the right-hand side, we've got bacteria, viruses, different grains or proteins like gluten, and toxins that are being secreted from these pathogenic bacteria. Pathogenic bacteria do damage to the gut lining because they do secrete toxins, and so when these things slip through the cracks and go into the bloodstream below, that triggers the immune system and causes an inflammatory response in the body. And so when this happens again and again and again, that's sort of what leads to this autoimmune triggering. There are particular bacteria that are more implicated in autoimmune triggering than others, and so having a look at a microbiome test can help you identify that. Opportunistic or pathogenic microbes also suppress secretory IgA. So we talked about secretory IgA on that previous slide. When we have a suppression of this immunoglobulin, it can trick the immune system into thinking things are a problem when they're not. The other thing is pathogenic bacteria can deplete immune nutrients. So we were talking about iron before. Iron is something that is really important in white blood cell functioning and helping your immune system develop and work appropriately. So definitely wanting to make sure that there's not too many of those that are causing that burden. The other thing is dysregulating your T helper balance. So we spoke about T cells again on the last page. They're one of our immune cells. And when we have sort of Th2 dominant presentations, that is when we see conditions like asthma and eczema pop up. The other thing is they produce toxins, as mentioned. So all in all, we really want to limit the amount of pathogenic bacteria that we have. So what can we do to help? If you've identified that there are signs of gut dysfunction and the immune system is not working effectively, there are definitely some things that we can do. Having a look at a microbiome test is one of those things, but it's expensive and definitely not in the budget of a lot of people. And so there are some things that we can address before we get to that stage. Helping restore the balance of beneficial bacteria is paramount. And we want to limit the overgrowth of those pathogenic strains. And so there's two ways that we can sort of address this. Number one is using probiotics. When using probiotics, it is very important to use less strains and choose strains that are well researched in terms of what they can provide benefit for. For example, let's say we were wanting to work on someone with a leaky gut. If that's something that you suspected, I would choose a strain called Bifidobacterium BB12. And so this BB12 does have research in terms of helping heal a leaky gut to an extent. The other thing is probiotics are not something that we use ongoing. So probiotics do not live in your gut when you take them. Let's say I took some of that BB12. If I tested my microbiome in 3 weeks' time, we wouldn't see any lingering levels of that BB12 strain. And that is because they stay for up to 7 days, sometimes a little bit longer depending on the strain, but all in all, we poo them out at the end of the day. So we want to have it in the gut for a short amount of time to elicit the response that we are wanting. But then we want to maintain our native bacteria more so through prebiotics. And prebiotics are the foods that feed our native species. Prebiotic fibers, there's a whole host of them on the market, depending on what bacteria you're wanting to grow, depends on the different prebiotic that you would use. If you're not testing your microbiome, you wouldn't really know which ones you're wanting to feed, but essentially you can use a combination of them to try and sort of feed a diversity. So some of the ones, Larch is one of them, that's in the BB Kids, GOS, FOS or inulin, and that stands for galacto-oligosaccharides or fructo-oligosaccharides. There's PHGG or partially hydrolyzed guar gum, just to name a few. The other thing we want to do is we want to provide proper nutrition. So your body needs nutrition to function, as does your gut to function correctly. Things like glutamine, you can imagine in the name it's got glue. It's like the glue that glues those gut cells together to help with that intestinal permeability. Zinc, particularly zinc carnosine, is also really important for maintaining that barrier. Vitamin D, also crucial, vitamin A, and demulcent herbs. So demulcent is essentially, if you can imagine like a chia seed, a lot of people know chia seeds, they have that mucousy substance that forms when you soak them in water. That is called mucilage. And so these demulcent herbs have mucilage. Marshmallow root and licorice are two of the main ones that have this action. And demulcent herbs in herbal medicine is something that sort of soothes that mucus layer in the gut and feeds that mucus layer in the gut, which is very important to maintain that barrier. We also have particular species of bacteria that like to feed on that mucus layer. And so while that sounds like a bad thing, it's actually quite a good thing if you have it in balance, because feeding on the mucus layer stimulates those mucus cells to grow new healthy mucus cells. The other thing we want to do is reduce inflammation. So there's a number of different things you can use, but turmeric is definitely one of those top anti-inflammatories. Ginger is another really good one if your child is into something a little bit more spicy, but reducing inflammation. And so we can do that through the diet as well. We don't have to use herbs per se, but opting for an anti-inflammatory diet, Mediterranean style diet is fantastic for reducing inflammation and reducing your intake of processed and packaged foods, which contributes to that inflammation. The other thing we can do is to utilize different herbs or ingredients that have a clear response on pathogens. Or detoxification. So detoxing toxins using things like charcoal or addressing different pathogenic bacteria, black seed or Nigella sativa, pomegranate, turmeric, all of these herbs are quite gentle and are not going to rock the boat too much. They are actually quite selective in what they choose to get rid of. So for example, pomegranate, it would reduce certain strains of E. coli. It might reduce things like Klebsiella, but it will actually feed lactobacilli species. Similarly with turmeric, it's a really good one to use for strep and staph infections, but it's not going to harm Bifidobacterium species. BB Kids is an incredible product that we have on the market, and so there are two different products. One of them is to repair the gut lining and the other one is geared at eliminating bacteria. So as we've kind of gone through the slides, we've seen how important it is to have a healthy gut barrier to reduce that inflammation and reduce that stimulation on the immune system. But we also need to kind of mop up any toxins and bacteria that might be growing out of check. In terms of how we sort of work through this protocol, you definitely want to start on the repair so that you can repair the barrier before you go on in and reduce some of those pathogenic strains. Because if you have a leaky gut and you go in and try and kill pathogens, you run the risk of those pathogens and toxins slipping through the cracks and creating this detox response. After you finish your 6 weeks of the repair and then the eliminate, you would then go back to the repair just to sort of top it all off. It is formulated by the wonderful Brooke, so there's a lot of thought that's gone into this product and how it can really impact a whole host of different conditions, but particularly the immune system and helping with immune resilience, which is really important heading into winter. Some of those key ingredients, we've got the activated charcoal, which is there to bind to toxins or heavy metals and reduce them from the body. The other thing with heavy metals is it blocks your receptors for other minerals attaching. So for example, mercury can displace selenium and zinc. And so therefore that child is not absorbing that selenium and zinc, which can have a huge impact on their immune system. So we want to make sure we're binding to any of those things that are going to be a barrier to immune health and immune resilience. Other things like the Nigella sativa, the pomegranate and the turmeric I've sort of spoken about, marshmallow root, again, that beautiful demulcent herb that's going to feed that mucus layer. And if you think about a child with a gut that is, red raw, let's say for example this kid has eczema, their skin is really inflamed, that skin barrier is not working effectively, you could probably assume that something similar is happening in the gut. And so we want to kind of soothe that barrier and soothe that layer so that we protect those underlying cells. The other thing that it contains, which I find extremely important for immune system, is those nutrients that we need for gastrointestinal support, the vitamins, the glutamine, all of those things which we use to support children with immune deficiencies or imbalances. Then we've got the pre and probiotics. As I said, strains are very important, and so we've used particular strains that are going to elicit a response that we are wanting. And so, for example, in the repair, something like LGG. It's designed to address the root cause and not just manage the symptoms. So, throughout this talk, we've spoken about all of those contributing factors to gut dysfunction. What we're doing is we're working on those contributing factors and not just throwing a zinc at them. We know that it comes down to so much more than that, particularly because so much of the immune system is situated in the gut. The other things that it targets: heavy metals, parasites, worms, Candida species, harmful bacteria, and lipopolysaccharides. So lipopolysaccharides are one of those toxins that bacteria produce that have an impact on the immune system. Essentially, by working on the gut, we're supporting the immune system. So to finalize it all, some of these top tips that we can walk away with today that can help you help your child. Definitely first thinking about reducing inflammation from their diet. So looking at reducing ultra-processed foods, artificial colors, and refined sugars. They definitely increase inflammation and they feed harmful bacteria and yeasts. The other thing we want to do is we really want to increase their fiber and we want to increase diversity in their diet. So we want to make sure we're feeding a whole host of different bacteria, not just the same bacteria every time. Fiber is found in many different plant foods, fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains. They all feed beneficial bacteria. Fermented foods, if your child will tolerate them, is a really good addition as well. So things like yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut. But if your child is presenting with something like eczema, which is a high histamine condition, I would definitely be cautious with those fermented foods because they are high in histamine themselves. Drinking your water is very important. Make sure that they're adequately hydrated. That's really important for cognitive function, for their gut function, for bowel regularity. and to transport nutrients around the body as well. Regular movement and physical activity that supports gut motility and their nervous system, allowing them to expel some energy and feel nice and calm and regulated after. The more we support their nervous system, the better their gut is going to be functioning. The other thing is to supplement when required. Sometimes their body is in a state that needs a little bit of additional help that we can't just get through diet and lifestyle. And so in this instance, utilizing products like the BB Kids is really going to get them to the place that they need to be much, much quicker and much more effectively.